Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to take a closer look at the impact of the Ukraine crisis on UK businesses. My name is Chris Forrest. I am the head of SME for Barclays Business Banking, and I'm delighted to be joined today by an eminent panel of guests who are going to help walk us all through what the Ukrainian crisis means for UK businesses and in particular SMEs. First of all, before we do that, before I introduce our guests, I just wanted to mention our Barclays Business Health Pledge, which was one of our commitments to SMEs and businesses as we get through out of the pandemic and into 2022 and beyond. So the Barclays Business Health Pledge, what is it? So first of all, it is a series of masterclasses up and down the country. We're running 50 per month all throughout this year. So if you haven't heard of them, please let us know. We will make sure you get invited to the local ones, chance to network with other businesses and learn what's going on both locally and nationally. We have also committed that we will have at least 20,000 client contacts and conversations every single month this year as we help businesses grow and get through the pandemic and out the other end. The other thing we've done is we've launched a Barclays Business Health Hub with lots of resources on it, lots of things that might help you cash flow, trade, other things. Please go on it. We'll send a link after this, but very good stuff on there. We've tripled the size of our business support function to help businesses as well. So we've tripled that size so that if businesses are struggling in any way, then there's plenty of support there to help them. And more to follow on charitable donations, which we will be doing throughout the year. So that's the Barclays Business Health Pledge. Please look out for that, much more to follow. But today, this masterclass is a national one. We've got hundreds and hundreds of businesses joining us. Thank you for giving up your time this morning. And we're going to be looking at the crisis in Ukraine in terms of how it affects the UK economy and UK businesses and what we do. Before I start, I've got to do a bit of a disclaimer, and I apologise for that, but our panel will be sharing views and opinions. They are their own, and they don't constitute advice from Barclays. So please note, every business is different, and we recommend you carry out your own independent research before making any decisions that will impact your business based on today's discussion. I have to do that disclaimer up front. But let me introduce the panel. Really pleased to have the panel with us today. The first is Will Hobbs, our Chief Investment Officer for Barclays Wealth. Will is he's my favourite economist. I don't know if Will calls himself an economist, but he's got some great stories and wonderful insight, and we'll hear from Will shortly. Our second speaker will be James Binns. James is our Global Head of Trade and Working Capital at Barclays Corporate Bank. James comes with a wealth of experience both in larger multinational corporates and the SME sector. It'd be great to hear from James afterwards. And then thirdly, and we're delighted to be joined by a representative of the National Cybersecurity Centre, Chris. Let's call him Chris. He's going to be oranged out, not blacked out for security purposes, and he will really get down and tell us what we should be doing as SMEs, what do we need to do in terms of protecting our own businesses. So some great speakers, and thank you for joining. We'll have lots of times for questions. You can click on the question button in the invite. Please do that. We've got questions coming in. So after the speakers have talked, we will get to that. Anything on your mind, and we'll try and answer that as best we can. But Will, I'm looking forward to your slot. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris, and good morning, everyone. And as Chris said, a very flattering introduction, but I'm not a real economist. We've got lots of those, and I'm lucky enough to represent lots of them. I'm sort of, my primary job is actually being an investor in a sense, and so I'm lucky enough to have access to lots of information that I will try and channel your way and try and give you some help in trying to find a signal through all the noise, I guess, at the moment is one way of thinking about it. My sort of short slot will be roughly divided up into where we've been from an economic perspective, where we might be, and where we're going. Now, as usual, I think it's very important to bear this disclaimer in mind. We've already had one disclaimer from Chris, but this is a different sort. This is really about the act of soothsaying. And very early on in my career, Well, I'd obviously just predicted something way too confidently. A very wise older colleague turned around to me and put a hand on my shoulder and said, the greater the confidence I hear someone predict the future, the less I trust them. So bear that in mind in these very, very uncertain times. What we can try and do is provide some navigation aids, I hope. So where have we been? Well, starting with the kind of world economy perspective, because this is the kind of the place to start. The world economy actually entered this latest crisis, this latest shock, enjoying significant momentum as it goes. Labour markets had, around much of the world, appeared to have healed far quicker, actually, than we might have dared to hope after the gigantic blows of the pandemic. Distortions remained, of course, and the sense remains that we, consumers, businesses, private sector actors, have been durably changed by the pandemic in important ways. So our expectations, our risk appetite, our attitudes to work, play, the digital realm have all been sculpted by the kind of trauma, isolation, and wider experience of the last few years. Labour markets, as you'll all be aware, reflect some of that change. In the US and the UK, there remain kind of historic gaps between the number and type of open jobs being offered by the economy, and on the other hand, the supply of workers the economy seems to be able to supply, to provide in order to plug those labour market gaps. Now, in this context, very hot labour markets, mostly recovered, all that kind of thing. It's entirely appropriate that central bankers were and are contemplating, raising their collective feet from the kind of monetary accelerator, slammed, necessarily to the floor for much of the last few years, and amidst the crisis. Interest rates need to rise. Central bank credibility as an inflation-fighting force really depends on it, and that's in the UK included. And if you think about it, Turkey provides a contemporary example of what it looks like when central bank credibility evaporates. And I think you've now got inflation running at the 40% mark, kind of thing. So, which, as you know, makes it extremely difficult to run a business or actually be an individual, where you're really just focusing on getting the wheelbarrow out in order to haul your cash down to the bread shop. Now, with all that, the UK has got a slightly more complicated set of trade-offs to manage, as you're probably all aware. There's a number of reasons for that. One, Brexit, obviously, bedding down this kind of seismic change to our trading arrangements, among other things, would have been complicated in the best of times. These are not the best of times. Two, the inflation expectations. Now, I think probably here it is the UK. We're very bad at measuring inflation expectations. We know much less about how our inflation expectations are set. That should be clear than we need to. It's not for want of trying, but the UK is the place where the warning lights are probably flashing most livid at the moment with regards to that, the risk of more entrenched inflation. The third point really is that here, and we're not alone in this in the UK, but the distribution of the incoming economic pain amongst households relative to, it is mismatched with the distribution of resources that might be helpful in absorbing that economic pain amongst households. So what you know is that, food and energy costs are largest as a proportion of spending amongst the lowest income houses, whereas the excess savings, this huge store of dry powder that the pandemic and the restricted savings spending opportunities that came with it kind of forced many households to accrue, that is overwhelmingly commanded by the top 40% of households. So that's the kind of where we were. So in that context, Ukraine, outside of the kind of unfolding humanitarian tragedy, there are obvious economic consequences. And the major point here is that I guess that Ukraine represents a stagflationary shock of still to be determined proportions. What that means is more inflation, less growth, but that kind of balance is very different depending on where you sit in the world. So if you start with the US, that's some reassurance in a way for the world economy, because the US tends to be the kind of keystone of the global economy, the most important capitalist economy by a mile. There, you are relatively insulated at the moment from Ukraine. the fact is that gas prices, as in petrol prices, they remain, pump prices remain a very political, a huge political issue, but they're much less of an economic issue. What is removed from consumers' pockets at the pump is recirculated within the economy, because the US is relatively self-sufficient, let's say, on a net basis from an energy demand perspective. Obviously, as you get to Europe, the dependency is far greater. Europe has much greater dependence, direct dependence on Russian gas, particularly, and it is there that if, for whatever reason, gas supply is stopped, the economic darkness will fall quite quickly on Europe, and people are now wondering whether or not a recession is coming, having previously been predicting a year of above trend growth, just to show you the sort of scale of the hit that Europe is expecting. There are also supply chain and other proximity concerns with regards to, to Europe's exposure. The UK, for its point, is slightly less directly exposed to Russian gas and oil and energy supply. But obviously, we obtain many of our basic commodities on international markets, and international, broad-based commodities really have prices have surged in the last little while, as you know. So these, the cost of living crisis is live here as well, as I've just pointed out. So the overall sort of context is one where central bankers have a much more delicate balancing act to try and achieve with regards to hauling back inflation, and actually and still nurturing that recovery from the blows of the pandemic. Final point, just quickly, before I get back to Chris and let you get into the sort of the more substantial parts of the presentation, where you're really going to hear, some pragmatic action rather than some sort of airy-fairy economics. History. What does history have to say about the effects of war on the economy? Well, obviously there's been an awful lot of research and papers written on this over the years. There are all sorts of conclusions you can draw. The one that I would think is probably more pertinent is there's recent work that's compared the aftermath of wars and pandemics. Now, pandemics, and one paper in particular, which compared the 12 largest pandemics scaled with the casualty scale to today's population with the 12 largest wars in history since the 14th century scaled to today's population. Now, the conclusion, you've got to be very careful with this. Wars, can be as different as they are similar, and the same goes for pandemics. How similar genuinely is the Black Death and its aftermath and even its economic context at the time to today? Not very, in reality. But you can sort of derive some roughly intuitive conclusions, which are supported to a certain extent by the data. Pandemics should be roughly deflationary. What happens is pandemics tend to reduce aggregate demand. They increase or decrease risk appetite. People feel the need to save more of their post-tax income in the aftermath of these things. That's tended to mean that in the aftermath of the major pandemics in history, you get a prolonged slump in growth and inflation. My argument actually this time would be that this time is different, that the context is so different that that's probably less the case now. The policymaker response, the technological response, I'm talking about the messenger RNA vaccine technology and so on. Wars, however, are different because what happens in wars, tragically, is both human and physical capital is destroyed. The latter requires replacement, investment. That tends to push inflation and interest rates up. The other point, which I think is very relevant to what we're seeing this week and this last few weeks, is that wars tend to stimulate defense spending. And you've seen that already in Europe with that, that old... I'll misquote Lenin now, but there are weeks where decades happen and the reverse. Really, that moment when Germany changed its post-war posture and suddenly decided to increase its defense expenditure to the 2%, that people have been asking for, NATO in particular have been asking for, the US in particular have been asking for some time. That was real. Most jaws were on the floor at this stage. So those effects, would be added together. Our point would be that there is probably the risk of more inflation than there was. And that is something that central bankers are going to have to continue to grapple with. So, we should expect the central bank in England, in the UK in particular, to have to continue to raise interest rates, even if the plight of certain parts of the society in terms of households and the pressure from the cost of living crisis continues to raise. Sorry, that was a whirlwind tour. But Chris, actually, sort of the thing I'm interested in and the thing I'm sort of less expert in and very useful for my side of things is to hear a bit more, I guess, on sort of where the rubber hits the road in terms of sanctions activity and what your thoughts are on that area.
Thanks, Will. Thank you. Yeah, look, I've got lots of questions to ask. Please feel free to ping in the questions as you're getting food for thought. It's interesting. I'm going to pass to James in a second, who can elicit some of that. But I did want to just read out, and apologies for reading this, but I want to get it right. We've had quite a few questions on what the sanctions mean for me, so it's a good question, Will. And we would say that, look, the official response from Western governments in terms of sanctions directed at Russia and Russian individuals deemed to be connected is evolving. So it's evolving at a lot of pace, isn't it? And so what we would definitely suggest is that please go on the government website as things evolve and change to keep up to date with it. Businesses need to take time to consider their structure, supply and distribution chains, including their suppliers and customers, and whether there's any links or dependencies with Russia, Ukraine, and any sanctioned individuals or other restrictions that get announced by the UK government, and actually how that might impact them. Businesses should be cognizant of restrictions when starting new businesses or contracts, and whether there are any implications for their business, such as assets, customers being frozen, inability to pay, all of that. And whilst Barclays cannot provide generic sanctions advice, customers should continue to speak to the relationship points, and we can definitely at least point them in the right direction if we can't specifically answer the question. I hope that answered your question, Will. It was a bit of a wordy response, and we can certainly get into detail if anybody wants us to do that. But before we do, James, I'm delighted you can join us. James is the Global Head of Trade and Working Capital for Barclays. What he doesn't know about global trade and working capital's not worth knowing, I would suspect. James, welcome.
Thank you very much, Chris. Good to be here, and hello to everybody. So I'm going to start by just talking about the general situation at the moment. As Chris referenced, it's rapidly moving and very fluid, and particularly has been over the last few weeks. Across the UK, across the European Union, across the US, we're seeing lots of very well-intentioned and the right thing to do in terms of sanctions, but there's a slight variation between the three jurisdictions, and equally a difference in timing as well, which is making things a little more complex. What we're also seeing is a certain element of self-sanctioning going on. You may have seen examples in the newspapers about dock workers refusing to unload Russian ships. Also, certain businesses and corporates refusing to deal with any Russia-linked business. So again, that's something to look out for and something that further complicates the situation. The sanctions themselves are aimed at a variety of organizations and individuals, including banks and businesses and individuals, and obviously, in particular, the oligarchs. And where that starts to get complicated is where the individuals own large businesses. And what that sometimes leads to, as you will have seen, in particular with the stories in the press about Chelsea Football Club, is potentially non-Russian businesses becoming sanctioned entities. And obviously Chelsea is a good example of that, and therefore again this becomes more of a global issue rather than a specific Russia-based issue. And all of this is particularly complex when you think about the number of different touch points that supply chains have across multiple jurisdictions. So some of the jurisdictions I mentioned there, but equally across multiple counterparties. Across the various different tiers of supply chain. So I think my general advice to everybody is, if you're thinking about undertaking any Russia-related business, or you have Russia-related business, then treat it with extreme caution. If I think about some of the specific risks around anything Russia or Belarus related, if I look at transaction risk, anything that involves a Russian port. You may have counterparties who are not Russian-based counterparties, but if there's a ship that is, port of origin is a Russia-based port, or destination, or even a midpoint, that ship could get impounded. Equally, a Russian vessel, a Russian flagged vessel, there may be no Russian port involved, But again, if there's a Russian vessel involved in any shipments, that could be impounded by foreign port authorities. Due to the sanctions, a lot of Russian banks have been disconnected from SWIFT, and that continues to happen, which is obviously making the exchange of payment messages and trade messages and so on more difficult to support any ongoing trade. And equally, what we're seeing now is a lot of the big courier companies are refusing to deliver physical documents into Russia as well. So consider that if you're needing to deliver any kind of documents or trade documents, etc., into Russia. And equally, all of this volatility is creating foreign exchange volatility at the moment. So individual transactions, something to think about in terms of another element of transaction risk. Chris talked earlier on about being careful around buyers who are Russian related. Think about ability to pay. Think about the credit risk that you'll be assuming if you give them any form of credit terms. But equally, think about the indirect risk. You might be selling to somebody who is non-Russian, but if they're then selling to somebody else who's Russian and their payment to you depends on them receiving that payment, then again, think about that indirect risk. And as part of all of that, think about any payment terms or credit terms you're willing to give those buyers on an ongoing basis. Equally, on the supplier side, think about the ability of your suppliers to deliver if there are Russian links, either direct or, again, indirect. If your suppliers' suppliers are being supplied by Russian businesses or Russian commodities, then again, something to think about, and again, something to think about from a payment terms perspective. There's a lot of financial and performance guarantees that exist between European and UK counterparties and Russian counterparties. If you have guaranteed Russian counterparties as part of your financial or performance risks, then think about the potential risk of those guarantees being called. But equally, if you in turn have been guaranteed by a Russian counterparty, then you should think about whether you have the right to call on those guarantees and do so before sanctions or etc. prevent your ability to do that. And equally, when you consider insurance cover, if you have insurance cover in place, think about if there's any Russian links. I talked about ports and vessels earlier on that might invalidate any of that insurance. So things to think about. We'll talk quite a lot about inflation and the general impact, secondary impact of everything that's going on. We've all been reading a lot about inflation over the last 6 to 9 months. And obviously that's to some extent being turbocharged by everything that's going on now, and in particular, the increase in commodities prices. All of that is further increasing the pressure on raw materials cost and availability. And at the same time, we still have a lot of disruption in supply chains and an increased cost in supply chains as well. The Drewry 40-foot container index, which is the average price of a 40-foot container, is currently at 8,470. It's slightly down on the last month or so, but it's still 75% higher than it was a year ago, and about $5,000 for a 40-foot container higher than the 5-year average. So we expect those to remain high, even if they might come off slightly. And of course, with all of this going on, supply chain disruption, cost of raw materials, the perception of risk in supply chains is higher, which means people are stocking more. It's now a case of just in case rather than just in time. And all of that, when you think about the combination of increased raw materials prices, supply chain disruption and increased transportation costs, and those high levels of inventory, is going to put more pressure on businesses' working capital cycles. So again, something to think about in terms of your future funding needs for your working capital, and making sure that you've got those in place at an early date. So I think the big word out there at the moment is resilience. It's financial resilience, it's supply chain resilience, not just in terms of the health of your suppliers, but making sure you've got the logistics in place to be able to move goods and services. And of course, the third item, which I know we're coming on to as part of our agenda, is the sort of technological resilience and cyber resilience as well. With that, Chris, I will hand back to you, and obviously looking forward to any questions later on.
Thank you, James. Goth, there's a lot to think about there. There's a lot to think about. I think a couple of things I would say, and we'll get to questions. Please keep posting them. I can see them coming in. You know, SMEs got through the pandemic, and I know it's tough, but I think, you know, they will navigate a way through this. I think we're confident of that. What I would ask for those SMEs dialed in today, please talk to us. I think most of what you said, James, is a working capital challenge, and you know, there's lots of things we can offer and do to support through that. So you know, the sooner we can have those conversations with you, the easier it will be for us to navigate with you through this crisis. But thank you, James, really insightful. Now our third speaker, Chris from the National Cybersecurity Centre. Chris, thank you for joining today. We get a lot of questions about cybersecurity, and obviously with what's going on, and Will, I think you positioned it really well. The sad human cost is the forefront of our mind in terms of Ukraine, but you know, that heightened risk of cyber attacks feels very real, and so we've asked Chris to come on today and give us some real practical tips on what's going on and what he sees. So Chris, thank you very much for joining.
Yeah, and thank you, Chris. Thank you for inviting me along this morning. I'm just going to go off topic ever so slightly, just to talk about the roles and responsibilities of the National Cybersecurity Centre and some of the threats we're seeing in the global cyber landscape. The NCSC, we were established at the end of 2016 to be the UK technical authority for UK governments. We are a part of GCHQ, so we receive great intel from our partners in Cheltenham, but we are that front-facing organisation to provide that support to UK businesses, government and private citizens, ultimately to make the UK the safest place to live and work online. And one of the reasons we were established was because the threat landscape is becoming ever so more sophisticated in cyberspace. Cybercrime and cyber attack has never been more prevalent. It's never been easier to carry out a cyber attack. And ultimately, our threat actors, both cyber criminals and nation-state actors, are becoming more sophisticated and more daring in their attacks. Just in the last year, UK cybercrime abroad has cost the UK economy £2.3 billion in victims. And a lot of this is because the digital footprint of businesses continues to grow. If you consider the devices and technology we use to carry out our day-to-day operations, especially for those organizations who have huge amounts of customer data, potential IP, and are working with operational technology, these are all lucrative targets for threat actors, both cyber criminals and nation states, to carry out their attack. And ultimately, what we found from the latest cyber breaches survey was that the main cause of a cyber breach is actually as a result of phishing attacks or suspicious emails coming into our organizations. The main cause, it was in fact 83% of businesses who suffered a cyber attack was a result of phishing emails. And what this demonstrates is a failing not only in our processes and technologies we have in place to secure our enterprises and estates, but a failing in user awareness and education as well. This demonstrates that making sure that we have a staff base and end users who are confident enough to identify and report malicious activity, both at work and at home, is absolutely vital to protecting our systems and our working day to day. So I'll turn now to talk about the Russian threat to Ukraine in terms of cyber attacks. We are aware that Russia is carrying out cyber attacks on Ukraine. This isn't the first time that Russia's used its cyber power. Back in 2015, Russia carried out an attack on its critical national infrastructure and took out the Ukrainian power grid for quite some time. What we're seeing now is destructive malware in Ukrainian systems, which is making a lot of their systems inoperable. And this is having huge impacts to not only Ukrainian way of lives, but the military response to the Russian attack. Now, while the NCSC is not aware of any current threats to UK organisations, there has been a historical pattern of cyber attacks against Ukraine with international consequences. There is the possibility of Russian cyber attacks against Ukraine spilling over to international organisations. So we are expecting further disruptive cyber attacks against organisations in Ukraine, which may also impact on UK organisations, which is why we've published guidance on our website. This can be found on our front page. Actions to take for when the cyber threat is heightened. We are now living through a heightened cybersecurity threat, and there is some great advice and guidance on the website to help businesses implement those controls, especially if you're a board member or a business owner. That is a great checklist to work through to make sure that you are building your cyber resilience and you are securing your systems and technology against any potential cyber attack or crime to your business. But ultimately, there is some great actions we can all take right now to secure not only our business, business working operations, but also our personal lives as well. We've recently relaunched the Cyber Aware campaign, which focuses on actions that we can all take straight away to better increase our cyber resilience. The number one control that we can all implement straight away is making sure that we have a strong, a separate password for our email accounts, both business and personal. Because what we often find is that users are guilty of reusing the same password for multiple accounts across multiple sites. And what that means is that if a business suffers a data breach and those credentials are out there on the dark web, chances are a cybercriminal may have access to that email and password and be able to gain access to your most critical accounts, whether this be your business accounts, your banking details. So making sure that we are securing these accounts with strong and separate passwords. But we can then go one step further and making sure that in our organizations, we are setting up two-factor authentication or two-step verification, whereby even if that password is compromised and is accessible by a threat actor or cyber criminal, that actor won't be able to get access to the account. And we know that banks are fantastic at implementing the security policy, whereby you have to provide that second level of authentication to access those accounts. So it's a great way, two great controls we can implement there. Make sure that we have strong passwords for our most critical accounts, and we are setting up two-factor authentication where possible. And there's also some great business advice and support on our website for all our businesses, regardless of shape and sector. If you are a smaller business, we have a great guide on our website to walk you through some of the top controls you can implement to secure your estate and increase your cyber resilience. And for those large enterprises, definitely check out the 10 steps of cybersecurity on the website, which goes into much greater detail about how you need to protect your data, your assets, and engage with your board members. But ultimately, cyber attacks do happen. No business is too small or too different to be the victims of a cyber attack. In fact, in the last year, we've identified that 40% of businesses were impacted by a cyber attack. It is more prevalent than we may initially think. So it's absolutely vital that every business considers their incident response plans and their incident management to a potential cyber attack, making sure that we are putting the cyber risk on our risk agenda, that we identify our critical assets and data that we have, and we are securing these down in the event of a cyber attack. But ultimately, having that strong business response plan, good business continuity planning, which is then exercised, can really help us should we be the victims of a cyber attack. And in fact, we have some fantastic resources on the website which help you understand what a cyber attack would mean for your organization. If you're not aware, we have a great toolkit on the website, Exercise in the Box. This is a free resource made up of a series of tabletop exercises which will walk you through a cyber attack in peacetime, that you can understand how a cybercrime will occur throughout its various stages and how you might respond at each of those intervals. And this is a fantastic resource not only for IT professionals within the organisation, but for the wider business, including the HR, legal and board, to understand the roles they will play during a cyber incident. Because as we know, cybercrime isn't just an IT issue. It's a business, it's a board issue, it's a HR issue, it's a finance issue, it's a legal issue. There is no part of the organisation cybercrime doesn't hit, which is why it's important that we take a collective responsibility to cyber attack, that we all play our part in protecting our business and making sure that we have a level of cyber hygiene that we continue to exercise and control as we go through a heightened cyber threat. There's a lot of resources I've just mentioned. All of the content can be found on the NCSC website. I'm happy to take any questions about any of the controls mentioned or anything about the Russian threat to both Ukraine and UK. But Chris, I'll pass back to you. And again, thank you for inviting me this morning.
Thank you, Chris. And I was on the website. Do you want to just give the website itself? Do you want to just say that again so people can direct them to it?
So the website is ncsc.gov.uk. What you'll find at the top of the page is different drop downs for business size. So whether you're a small or medium-sized enterprise, there'll be a sub page there, and for our large organizations, some great resources on that page as well.
Great. Thank you, Chris, and thank you for taking the time to join. It's not as scary as it sounds. I have a few charities, and I was on your website doing the very thing you described last night. And actually, it's some of it's pretty obvious, isn't it? But we just probably, it's not front of mind always. So it is really helpful, really clear website. Thank you. Thank you for joining. Now, I've got lots of questions. So speakers, get ready. I want short, crisp answers, please. Don't dodge them. Try not to dodge them anyway. We keep our audience interested. Keep those questions coming. I'm going to take the first one. The first question we've had from a client is, with all the cost increases at short notice and clearly the ambiguity going on around the world at the moment, will we really need to do budgets, cash flow forecasts and the like, or will you take a more pragmatic approach to supporting customers? I thought it was a really good question. Talk to us as early as you can, but we will try our very best to get there as pragmatically as we can. I know it's a bit of a politician's answer, and we're not unnecessarily looking for reams of work, paperwork, and there are ways we can fund invoices, fund assets quickly to keep businesses going. So just reach out to us, your local relationship manager teams, and we'd be delighted to help. And Will, there's lots of questions that are economically related, and maybe James can take some of them as well. So if I just fire them out and then see where we go with it, if that's all right. First of all, how will the Ukrainian crisis affect business taxes? It's interesting, wasn't it? Given we've just had a spring budget. Will, do you want to pick that one up?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, so yes, let's see. The spring budget didn't. I think the major problem at the moment for governments and sort of, and central banks as well is that when you've got extremely high incoming inflation and worries about expected inflation as well, your capacity to maneuver is a lot less. So, certainly the Chancellor has indicated that, if you look at the sort of the last budget or the spring budget, there is scope to do more by the looks of things. So the OBR, the Office for Budgetary Responsibility, was a bit generous. People do say what the OBR giveth, they can also take it away. But there is, before the next election, scope for a bit more of a giveaway. That message is clear. But the inflationary backdrop makes big fiscal giveaways quite unlikely, I would say.
almost a politician's answer, but we'll give you, well, not too bad, not too bad. James, I'm going to come to you. I've got two questions for you. I'll give you them both, and then maybe you can have a go at them. So the first is, what is SWIFT, right? So what is SWIFT, and what, there's a lot of media noise. Some people, if they're a domestic trading business, maybe never heard of SWIFT before. So it'd be good if you could maybe articulate that for our audience. And then we've got a question here, James, which maybe you can tackle. We're seeing inflationary pressures and cost rises impacting businesses. Which industries are you seeing with that in particular? Is any industry subsectors that you could point to on that? Over to you.
Thanks, Chris. So first of all, SWIFT is basically the international messaging system which banks use to communicate with each other. So that's how we make all of our payments, how we exchange trade documentation, and how we transact with each other securely. So when a bank is excluded from SWIFT, it becomes very difficult for them to be able to transact. Equally, there are some of the larger businesses out there. Some of those have direct access to SWIFT, which enables them to issue messages directly to banks. But that shouldn't impact them directly. But so broadly speaking, that is what SWIFT is. It's like the all the communications channels between banks. I hope that explains it a little bit. In terms of your second question, any particular sectors? I mean, obviously, as a result of the crisis, we've seen oil and gas prices go up significantly. Today's Brent crude price is at 118, I think, was as high as 128. Pre-crisis, it was down in the 75, 80s mark. And obviously, that will impact any industries directly related to oil and gas. It will also directly impact large swathes of us because obviously transport costs will increase as a result of all of this. But equally, the other thing to consider is food-based commodities. So the price of wheat. Russia and Ukraine are big wheat and grain producers, and we're already seeing significant increases in the price of wheat. So again, sectors who are exposed to that. The other one that maybe some people haven't thought of is potash, and potash is the ingredient to fertilizers. And again, Russia and Ukraine are huge producers of the world supply of potash. And again, that will start to impact crops and food commodities more broadly as we continue. And then the other direct impact is natural gases and obviously metals. So natural gases, believe it or not, Ukraine is the world's largest producer. It produces nearly over 50% of the world's supply of neon gas. And neon gas is one of the key ingredients in the manufacturing of semiconductor chips. Of course, semiconductor chips go into electronics, into cars, and so on. So again, we've seen a lot of disruption in that sector over the last 6 to 9 months. That could continue with these developments. And then metals, the price of nickel, some of those metals which go into electronics, into batteries. Nickel is obviously more widely used in stainless steel, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong there, Will, but it has a fairly wide application. So, so I think everyone is going to see the impact of this to some extent in terms of inflationary pressures. I don't think any sector will be immune from it. But obviously, there will be some sectors which are more significantly impacted by that. Hopefully, that gives you the answer you need.
Sorry to interrupt you. And, so I mean, wheat and grain are obvious ones. 80% of that is coming out of Russia and Ukraine. Are you seeing the larger corporates you deal with? How are they coping? What's their strategies to almost diversify away from those parts of those regions, or is there anything they're doing?
Well, I think this has been ongoing for some time as a result of a lot of the supply chain disruption we saw throughout COVID and so on. Supply chains have been looking at themselves to understand where they've got concentration risks, where they need to diversify, etc. And I think this will only accelerate that move. It's obviously very difficult when you've got something that comes quite quickly, like this has done, to react on a short-term basis, because supply chains are very complex, often slow-moving things. And I think, therefore, from my perspective, it's about really on a day-to-day basis at the moment, it's looking at where you've got exposures, where you've got risks in those, in your supply chains, understanding how you can manage them in the short term, and then more strategically, how you need to think about that in terms of your longer term plans and ambitions. But equally, as I said, it's also about making sure that you've got those working capital limits in place to help support you and your supply chains, and making sure that you've got your logistics contracts, your logistics visibility in place to help manage any risks that start to emerge in there. And Chris, as you quite rightly said earlier, please talk to us and talk to us early about any questions you have or any needs you have. And that if you do that, that will give us the best chance of being able to help.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, some of the things you said earlier around performance guarantees, insurance risk, that's something that is definitely front of mind. So it's just thinking through those implications. Now, Will, I haven't asked you yet, and I always ask you this. We used to stand on stage pre-pandemic, and I used to ask you the same questions around what's going to happen to interest rates and inflation over the next 24 months. Used to be quite a benign conversation. It's probably not now, is it?
Less so, Chris, isn't it? I mean, I think there is, and one of the questions sort of referred to this a little bit about whether we're in a sort of paradigm shift, whether we're in a new world. And the chances seem to be increasing a bit that the sort of global economic tectonic plates have shifted underneath our feet during this pandemic, and maybe they were changing already. And part of that is that there are many economists who argued that if the last economic paradigm was really about, abundant supply of everything almost, workers, because of the accession of Chinese workers to the global economy, the accession of Eastern Europe into the global working force as well as kind of increased female labor force participation and various other factors meant that you just had lots of workers to supply into that economy, but also commodities. Technological revolutions in shale, among other things, increased our access to many commodities. So, if the last cycle was characterized by abundant supply and therefore okay demand growth meant that, the economy grew at a reasonable pace, but with very little inflation, you're seeing a slightly different context now. Obviously, the necessary transition to more renewable energy sources, combined with the fact, the aging population, no new China workforces waiting to happen to the global economy. In fact, a change in many workers' expectations about what they want from work and so on. That's what we're seeing play out at the moment. That suggests that the risks of inflation are a little bit more in this current sort of economic paradigm. So certainly, I would say that one of the things that is important to think about is that the trend in ever falling inflation-adjusted interest rates that we've seen over the last few decades, that may not continue. That our expectation is that certainly in the short term, central bankers are going to have to get real interest rates, inflation-adjusted interest rates, into positive territory in order to sort of try and get a grip on inflation. So that means all of these banks are going to be very busy. Whether they get as far as some of them have planned, that is open to some debate, because as well as that, the level at which interest rates start to bite, that will tell us whether the speed of the economy has changed. The natural trend growth rate has changed over the pandemic, and there certainly have been big changes. The final point just to mention on that, because I saw a question on house prices. Remember, with house prices, the relationship there's all sorts of things that define house prices in the short term: mortgage availability, trends, the dash for space, all this kind of stuff. But there is very robust evidence that it is real interest rates that are really the Pied Piper for house prices over the longer term. So, if you see a change in that trend in real interest rates, you should expect probably less positive house prices. I think the Bank of England found a relationship saying that 1% increase in real interest rates over time, not immediately, it corresponds to a 20% decline in house prices in the UK. So, like I say, that's not a house price crash immediately, but it does suggest a slightly less benign or a slightly less upward trajectory environment for house prices if real interest rates are moving in the other direction.
And I've got to ask you this, because you're part of Barclays as well. Equities, just as a quick response, equities don't seem to be taking the pain that some might fear.
Yeah, I mean, it's bizarre. I mean, I think, Chris, I mean, the main thing to think about here is that the US economy is the Pied Piper generally for the world's stock markets. It sets the beat. It's the most important capitalist economy by a mile still. And so because the US economy is still showing significant momentum, it is, a more difficult environment for equities, certainly with sort of, like I say, real interest rates moving upwards. But you've got in favor that investors are already pretty depressed about life. And so a lot of bad news is already factored in. And besides which, the world's companies are still generating, quite a bit of profits momentum. So, yeah, long term, like, these things are about, inventing new stuff and getting better at using it, which is a quite reliable trend from humanity. But in the short term, it's a pretty, surprising, surprising piece of resilience. I agree.
Thanks, Will. Thank you. Let's pivot back to Chris, if I can, for a second. So, Chris, just a couple of questions on what's the what's the trend in attacks, if that's the right language to use, in terms of if you're a business right now, what is it that you're seeing, maybe as a result of this current war and crisis? Anything new or different that businesses should be thinking about or aware of?
So the biggest threat we've seen in the last year is ransomware attacks, and many will remember the WannaCry incident, which impacted the NHS back in 2017. Ransomware is becoming ever more prevalent, and the preferred, let's say, flavor of cybercrime for many threat actors. Ransomware has become such a prominent and has such a level of sophistication now that it's considered it's as damaging as a state-sponsored attack, which is why businesses really need to exercise their instant response mechanisms and making sure that they have good, robust backups in the case of impact to business and a loss of data or assets. Having strong, clear backups and being able to get up and back online as quickly as possible is so vital for your disaster recovery planning. We know that cyber attacks don't last a few hours, definitely not a few days. We are looking at weeks, months, and potentially years to recover from the impacts of cybercrime and fraud on a UK business. Making sure that we are, aware of the issues, that we are pushing out the correct messaging and engaging with our cyber resilience partners is absolutely vital. But coming back to my earlier point, just making sure that we are all doing the bare basics, making sure that your end users have a degree of cyber awareness and exercising cyber hygiene to mitigate the potentials of the latest cyber threats, whether that be from cyber criminals or state-sponsored attacks to UK cyberspace.
Thanks, Chris. That's helpful. Thank you. And again, the website has got much more detail on that. So thank you for that. Now I'm going to ask the last question to Will and James. So quick fire answer from both of you. Really interesting question from a client come through around localization. And do you sense that the world will become less global as a result of the pandemic and obviously the war in Ukraine? And do you sense that's an opportunity for SMEs or a threat? What do you sense? James, could it come to you first?
Sure, Chris, thanks. Well, some of you may have seen the headlines in the last couple of days. Larry Fink, the head of BlackRock, talking about the end of globalization. I must admit, I don't quite buy that. I think absolutely, as we were saying earlier, everything that's going on now will cause supply chains to rethink, potentially to reshore some of their supply chain activity and potentially to nearshore or even onshore some of it. But that is easier said than done. These supply chains, as I was saying earlier, are hugely complex in many instances, have been built up over decades, and it takes decades to move them, depending on the different sectors. So yes, I think we will see an element of nearshoring and localization, but I think that will possibly be more limited in the short term than maybe some of the newspaper headlines suggest. And in terms of opportunities to, small and medium-sized businesses in the UK, absolutely, I think that does represent an opportunity for certain sectors where those supply chains are more movable, and there's the opportunity to basically counter the price impact of moving with the certainty impact of being able to deliver, from a nearer shore environment, which may make some UK suppliers more competitive than they might have been able to be in the past.
Sorry. Yeah, no, just following on. I would 100% agree with James on that. This is a much better newspaper headline than it is a tangible, actionable reality. And also, in many ways, it sort of understates what globalization is about in terms of some of the communications and so on. I mean, it's not just about trade routes, so there is a potential for some bifurcation of the world in terms of sort of this kind of authoritarian axis that seems to be developing. But I'm not so sure about that either. To be honest, China's reliance on Europe and the developed world consumer is gigantic still, and that's unlikely to be moved that quickly, in all honesty. So again, I think we've got to look through the newspaper headlines and listen to James. That would be my advice.
Or will, I would say modestly. Listen, thank you. We're running out of time. So I would first of all like to thank our speakers for giving up their time this morning. Chris, thank you very much for pointing us in some pragmatic directions. It didn't feel too scary. It feels achievable that we can become a bit more safe in our day-to-day business dealings. So thank you for that. Will, as ever, thank you for your enigmatic view of the world, which is wonderful. You should listen to Will's podcast, which goes out every week. It's a good listen. I listen to it on a walk and it's wonderful. So thank you, Will, as ever. James, thank you. Thank you for keeping our clients safe and trading worldwide, whether that's multinationals who bank with Barclays or SMEs indeed. Thank you, James, and thanks for your time this morning. Just remains for me to say thank you for listening in and giving us an hour of your time, which I know is very precious on a Friday morning. I would direct you to the Barclays Business Health Pledge. If you put it in your search engine, you will see it come up, and keep it, maybe add it to your favourites, and we're going to keep adding collateral to that. The other thing is, let me know if there's anything on a masterclass that you would like us to drill down to a bit more to help you become more resilient and trade through 2022. We'd be delighted to do that. We're having masterclasses, as I said, all over the country all year. I hope to see you at some. Some will be virtual and many will be face-to-face, and it'd be great to see you. So thank you very much for joining this morning, and have a great weekend. Thank you.